Since the last time I made a video, I've been diagnosed with something that's called savant syndrome, and I'll explain in a minute what exactly that is for those of you who don't know. Now, the thing is that savant syndrome is not actually a diagnosis that's found in the DSM-5. That's the diagnostic manual. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is because savant syndrome, fortunately, is non-pathological. So again, I went to a secular professional instead of a holistic one, because all sorts of holistic and spiritual professionals, when I go to them, they kind of just, automatically resonate with me. And so, of course, think I'm legit. And so, of course, they're always going to give me a positive diagnosis. But I wanted to really be hardcore and go into somebody secular and be like, okay, are they going to see me as crazy and give me a diagnosis of schizophrenia, because there is potential that I could be schizophrenic or narcissistic or, yada, 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 like any other pathological conditions that I could have. Because let's face it, all the claims that I make, all the topics I talk about, they're all very extreme, very radical. So I can't just leave all sorts of pathological diagnoses off the table. Excuse me, I really should go in to a diagnosis wondering if there's something there that's deficient about me, mental illness or otherwise, if there's something there. So that's why I went to somebody secular. And luckily, after weeks and weeks and weeks of kind of going through these sessions, I fortunately have not been diagnosed with anything pathological yet. With that said, savant syndrome is a very open-ended diagnosis, so it doesn't fully explain the condition according to this professional that I'm seeing. They still think there's probably other stuff going on beyond the savant syndrome. Now, fortunately, there again, even in that instance, they don't think I'm like insane or anything like that. They don't think I have anything pathological. So from what they're saying, the further stuff beyond savant syndrome, like the stuff that cannot really be explained or captured by savant syndrome, they think that that stuff is fortunately going to be non-pathological as well. Like there's just going to be something very different about me or something like that. So luckily, from the sounds of it, I'm not going to be diagnosed with anything pathological, but again, I'll remain open-minded just in case there's anything pathological there that's ever found beyond the savant syndrome, since it is still just an open-ended diagnosis. But yeah, fortunately so far, it's just been non-pathological, and savant syndrome is non-pathological. So that's one reason why it's not in the DSM-5. Another reason is, well, because like I was just saying, it's an open-ended diagnosis. There's not really any specific condition that you can point at and call savant syndrome. It's more like an umbrella term for a diverse set of conditions. So here's basically what savant syndrome is. It's when you look at a person's like general level of cognitive development, you could say like their baseline, and then they have some sort of niche skill, maybe like one or two, that are so niche that they don't really match up with their general level of cognition. So like, for example, let's say a person has an IQ of 70. Now, IQ is not a fully accurate way to analyze somebody's level of cognition, but just to use that as an example, let's say somebody has an IQ of 70, so they have like a level of cognition which is significantly below the average of 100 IQ, and yet they're able to recite 100,000 digits of pi. It's like a very niche skill there. Like a lot of times a savant skill can not only be very niche, but unfortunately useless. Like people will say, what's the practicality of naming 100,000 digits of pi? Like it's impressive, but it's impractical at the same time. So yeah, they can be very niche in that sort of way. Like somebody being able to recite 100,000 digits of pi, on the surface, that looks like that should take an extreme level of cognition. And yet here's this person with a level of cognition that's far below the average of the population, and they're able to do it. So that's basically what a savant skill is. It's a niche skill that doesn't really match up with their general level of cognition. Now, with that said, there's usually like 3 different categories of savant syndrome. Well, not just 3, like 3 in terms of the level that the savant skill is at in relation to the person's general level of cognitive development. So along that axis, there's generally 3 categories, but there's no specific consensus yet on how many categories there should be exactly. And then also beyond just that axis of, how extreme is the savant skill, there's other categories beyond the three that we find along that axis. So, you could be an acquired savant or an autistic savant. Savant syndrome overlaps with autism a lot of times, even though it's possible for a savant to be non-autistic. So there's all sorts of other categories like that. But then on this axis of, okay, well, how much of a misfit is the person's savant skill relative to their general level of cognition? Along that axis, you have three general levels, usually three categories. You have a splinter skill savant, where their savant skill, okay, it doesn't really match up with their general level of cognition, but it's not super profoundly outside of it either. And then if it's something more profound, it just really doesn't match up with their general level of cognition, then that's where you get into the second category, which is called a talented savant. And then the third category is the skill really just doesn't match in at all. You have a huge skill spike. It really just doesn't fit in with their general level of cognition. And that's what you call a prodigious savant. Now, the first category is the most common, a splinter skill savant. It's usually just estimates, but it's estimated that there's about 1 in 10,000 people who have it. So that's rare, but it's not all that rare. 1 in 10,000 people, I'm sure all of you have probably met a splinter skill savant at some point in your lives, even if you didn't know that they were a savant. So it's common enough for you all to have probably known somebody like that. Maybe somebody who didn't have a very high level of cognition, but then they were a super talented artist or something like that. But then if that talent goes profoundly far, then you have a talented savant. And I'm not sure what the estimates are on that. They didn't tell me. And then the really rare one is what's called a prodigious savant. That's where it's just really is this skill spike that just really doesn't match. So again, somebody whose cognition is well below average, but then they can do all sorts of profound mathematical feats, 100,000 digits of pi, that whole recitation or something, or more extreme than that even. And with that said, a savant skill doesn't even have to look a specific way or be in a specific field. There's all sorts of different diverse types of savant skills. So a person may be a mathematical savant and have a mathematical savant skill, like the digits of pi example. Or they may be a musical savant where they can just hear a song played on the piano and then all of a sudden they can start playing it on the piano instantly. Just a whole diverse set of different types of savant skills. So savant syndrome as a diagnosis really is an extremely open-ended one. A musical savant can have an entirely different condition or, needless to say, personality than, let's say a savant who's good at just painting or something like that. A musical savant can be entirely different from a painting savant, could be entirely different from a savant who's awesome at physics or something like that. So yeah, there's no specific way a savant has to be. So it's not a specific condition. That's the second reason why savant syndrome is not in the DSM-5. There's no specific way that a savant is defined to be. It's just if you have this skill which doesn't match up with your general level of cognition, then you're a savant. But that savant skill can look all sorts of different ways. It can provide all sorts of different traits. So there's not really one specific condition that we can point at and call savant syndrome. It's more just that savant syndrome is an umbrella for all sorts of different types of traits and conditions and savant skills, essentially. So yeah, very open-ended diagnosis. So just because I've been diagnosed with it, from what they told me, it's still open-ended. They still think there's probably more going on there beyond the savant syndrome. Luckily, as I said, they think that whatever that stuff beyond it is, it's most likely non-pathological as well, but I'll keep my mind open just in case it's pathological or anything like that. Also, the majority of people who are diagnosed with savant syndrome, they tend to have some sort of nervous system disorder that goes along with it. So the majority of savants do have a general level of cognition that's significantly below average, and then their skill spike can take them up to average or way beyond average or even up to expert level or beyond and stuff like that. So the majority of savants are like that. Now, there is a minority of savants where their baseline general level of cognition is average or even above average. So those types of savants do exist, and they're called high functioning savants. But the majority of savants are not high functioning. They unfortunately are born with a neurological disorder. So it doesn't have anything to do with their intelligence. They're actually born with some sort of neurological disorder where they're significantly neurologically impaired, and that's what causes their level of cognition to be well below average. So it's not just that they're like dumb, but then, oh, they can play all sorts of songs on the piano. No, like they actually need caretakers in their homes to take care of them because they have this physical neurological condition. So like they're physically unwell, they're neurologically impaired, and they unfortunately cannot take care of themselves. But then, you know, let's say they're a musical savant, all of a sudden they can just hop on the piano and like play Beethoven, and, you know, like they just learned it in an instant, stuff like that. So the majority of savants are like that. They have a significant cognitive or neurological impairment, but then they still have that savant skill spike up above their general level of cognition where the impairment doesn't really seem to affect it. And then with high functioning savants, where their baseline is average or above average, they still have a skill spike where they still demonstrate some sort of skill that does not match up with their general level of cognition. Now, I do have some nervous system symptoms which do impair me to some extent. Luckily, though, I have been diagnosed as a high functioning savant despite that, because I'm still generally functional. So I'm fortunate enough and blessed enough to have not been born into this life with a significant level of cognitive impairment where, you know, like unfortunately a majority of savants have, where they need somebody to be taking care of them full time. They literally need a full-time caretaker. And yeah, so I'm fortunate enough to not be living through that type of a situation here. But I do still have some nervous system symptoms that crop up occasionally, and those do need to be taken care of. So even though the savant syndrome itself is non-pathological, it is possible for it to cause pathological symptoms, or at least be correlated with them. So for example, nobody really knows if savant syndrome is what causes the significant levels of cognitive impairment that they see in the majority of savants, or if it's just correlated with them. But either way, you know, having this impressive skill to play all sorts of songs on the piano or learn Beethoven in an instant, obviously that's not like a mental illness. Obviously that is not pathological. So that's why savant syndrome itself is non-pathological. It's just that it can either cause or at least be correlated with all sorts of pathological symptoms like a nervous system disorder. So that tends to be my case. So I've been diagnosed with savant syndrome, which itself is non-pathological, but I do have some nervous system symptoms which unfortunately go along with that. But on the fortunate side, they're not at that significant level of impairment where I need a full-time caretaker or anything like that. So that's why I've been diagnosed with high-functioning savant syndrome. And I've also been diagnosed as a prodigious savant. So high-functioning prodigious savant. And again, prodigious savant syndrome just means that my savant skill it's really far outside what fits in or matches up with my level of cognition. And so all of you might think that the topics I discuss here on this channel, Everything Explained, that these are like my savant skill. Ironically, no, I have never demonstrated my savant skill on this channel. Now, with that said, the topics that I discuss on this channel are foundational to topics that I delve into with my savant skill. But nothing here on this channel is that stuff. It's foundational to it, but it's not that stuff. I can't really talk about that stuff on YouTube because it's too much gibberish, you know, like for example, you can't make a YouTube video on how to build a Saturn V rocket. You can make all sorts of YouTube videos that are foundational to that, but if you just start making a video on how to build a Saturn V rocket, it's just going to be a lot of gibberish. You can't fit all that in a video. Now I use the example of building a Saturn V rocket, but unfortunately my savant skill is not that practical. It is not practical enough to build all sorts of new technological innovations or anything like that. I use the rocket example to show you, like, there are topics that you cannot fit in a YouTube video, not even a 3-hour, 4-hour actualized.org or self-help lecture seminar style video. can't fit building a Saturn V rocket into a video, even if it is the length of a feature film. It doesn't work. It's going to come out as pure gibberish. So my savant skill, whether useless or not, it at least has a level of nicheness or depth where it does make it sort of gibberish without anything foundational underneath it to accommodate it. So all the topics I discuss here, these are foundational to it, but I can't really discuss those because it just turns to gibberish. I have to discuss those more with professionals and stuff like that. And so with that said, from here on out, I mean, I am continuing to kind of trend further in the secular direction, since these secular professionals have tended to be so accommodating so far. You know, it's a lot different than the lack thereof, which I've found in spirituality and things like that. I've really just kind of continued to trend in that non-spiritual direction, like I've said, because it seems that my work generally is more suited for that environment, more so than I had originally thought in the past. With that said, you know, with the nervous system symptoms, I've been trying to figure those out. Even though they crop up occasionally, fortunately not all the time, they still do need to be taken care of. And that's one unfortunate instance where it's kind of bad that savant syndrome is so rare, especially prodigious savant syndrome, like what I have, is that, you know, there's not really enough people to study exactly what's going on with the nervous system stuff, at least not to a large extent. I mean, it's ongoing. There are further medical studies with that stuff. It's just no full-on consensus has been reached yet where full-on prescriptions can be had. Because, I mean, it's really only estimates, but it's been estimated that fewer than 100 people in the world have prodigious savant syndrome. I mean, some sources, according to my professional that I go to see, some say like 80, some say 75, some say 50. So yeah, it's generally said to be under 100. And that's unfortunately too rare to really come up with any specific prescriptions or condition or definition or anything like that. So yeah, high functioning prodigious savant syndrome is something which is continuing to be studied. Not even just like that one specifically, like I'm giving the specific label that I've been given, like high functioning prodigious savant, but just really prodigious savant syndrome or savant syndrome in general are continuing to be studied. So yeah, this is all stuff that I've kind of talked over and looked into myself after having the diagnosis. So yeah, I don't have a full picture on it yet. Like I said, this is all kind of just an amalgamation of what I heard from, you know, the person that I go to see and get examined by, and then also kind of looking into it myself afterwards. You know, of course you get curious, you do a lot of reading, and so I try to distinguish out what I read from, you know, what the professionals say, because sometimes that can get mixed in, you know, like, so again, I've heard all sorts of estimates that the number of prodigious savants is 80 or 75 or 50 or whatnot, so they can all get mixed in, and the important thing is for me to try to tease that out. But yeah, I'll be continuing with that in the future, more examination, kind of see what's going on with me more and more and more. But fortunately, at least for now, it is non-pathological, and if the predictions, you know, the professional foretellings are correct, then whatever they find beyond it should also be non-pathological. So hopefully that continues to be the case. So fortunately, I have not been diagnosed as insane, but I still got to watch my ideas closely because they are very wild claims. Certainly, I have made very insane sounding claims, so really got to watch myself and be careful, even with this diagnosis there as a form of assurance. All right, so with all that said, I'll be kind of figuring out where I want my YouTube channel to head in the future given this diagnosis, because there is more beyond the diagnosis itself that kind of leads me to reflect on what exactly my work should be and what trajectory it should take. But I'll have more notes on that in the future. And until then, thanks for watching. Create a nice day.